Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Conceptualism. I'm very happy today to have a fellow artist, scholar, multidisciplinary personal explorer of all kinds of interesting ideas. Go to his Instagram page to see more of this beautiful exploration. He's an author with a book that's about to be published in 2022, I believe. And wow, I'm excited. Oh, and he's a musician to boot it all. So yeah, this is going to be very interesting. And welcome to the show, Fayyaz. And it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Afraz.
So I wanted to start by asking you, uh, you know, uh, as a writer, do you actually enjoy writing? I mean, the process, the nitty gritty, the putting the words on the page.
I do. I absolutely love it. Yes. The process, even more so than the finished product, it's
Hmm.
the act of doing it itself for me is meditative. It's explorational. Um, it's exploring the world through an inner exploration, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I would concur. I think the act of writing, even the act of script, right? Like putting in an abstract sense, putting down marks on a page that are meant to mean something. I think even the idea of that is very spiritual, you know, um, because it hints at the impermanent permanence of existence.
Yes. I mean, while you're talking about spiritual, I've been now reading and writing in Arabic for the last couple of years.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
it calls to mind this, even something like the second verse of the Quran, Al-Baqarah,
Mm,
it starts with Alif Lam Mim. So there are just letters.
mm,
And, there are all kinds of theories about why this was be done. And
mm.
is it about the letters themselves or some deeper meaning? Or, do those letters, Alif Lam Mim is ilm, so knowledge.
Knowledge, yeah.
There's another theory that says that because the Prophet Muhammad was known commonly to be not a reader and writer,
Mm,
that when he would recite this in public and recite these letters, it would draw people's attention because they're like, how does this man who doesn't read and write, how does he know these letters of the alphabet?
mm.
But the act of writing itself, the idea of text, the idea of multiple meanings,
Mm.
is something that's inherent in the Quran, and that's very interesting to me. And actually, that verse Al-Baqarah talks about those who believe in the unseen and the hidden and the not manifest and all these kinds of things, all these suggestions about diving deeper into something, and
Mm,
that's through text.
mm. Absolutely. And then the examination of what a text is, right? Like the idea that anything really can be a text. A shard of pottery, a rock, a tool, a cave painting is a text. In a sense, a leaf is a text. A droplet of water is a text. I'm rendering it absurd now, but really, I mean, anything is a text
Of
when you
course.
think about it. And I like that idea that a text is not just something that's written. And the reason I say this is, of course, because you know when you go prehistory or as yeah, I mean, there's no such thing as, for example, an ahistorical context, right? There's always history, but the idea that history has to be written, I think, is an idea that I question all the time, because I think the deepest histories are actually the unwritten histories, and I say that both in the tangible and intangible ways. So I mean, for example, our DNA contains the history of everything, and even on the atomic level, for example, the structures contain histories, like, for example, when you draw an atom, you draw the electron cloud. You don't actually say where the electron is, because that's impossible. You say where it's most likely to be. So in a sense, I think even the act of observing is, in a sense, or bearing witness, is historical. So no matter what you're doing, I think there is history in a way, and that history is captured in perhaps a manner that not everybody would necessarily put into the idea of being historical, but I think is. Like, for example, the way the continents are, the way the continents broke off. In a sense, that is a historical and even textual reference, I think, to the history of the planet, for example. You know?
Absolutely. I think also the idea of history is that the idea that we can have a complete picture of history from text it's absurd, because history is written by humans, and humans are subjective and have their particular points of view. And even if you would say to assemble a whole group of people who were present at a particular event and have them, you would never get them to agree on what just happened. You know, any seminal event, be it, you know, the French Revolution or a world war or something, you still could not get agreement. We still don't have agreement today as to exactly what happened.
Yes, and ironically, the most accurate picture is painted by the negative space.
Yes. Yes. And I think that applies to your analogy about the earth and the physical land. I mean, if you look at something like the genocide of Native Americans in this country, in the USA, it's quite absent from mainstream discourse. But if you go to the West, if you go to the mountains, you go to the lands, you go to, for example, I've been to Monument Valley in Arizona and Utah, and there's a Navajo founding myth that this is where the earth cracked open and the first people emerged, and that's why the Grand Canyon is there. And so, but you can actually engage with that text, with that landscape, and learn about that history in a way that you would never be able to from books.
Indeed, and that's why I think it's so important when you really want to know something, you want to know a story, is to try to go to a living source, a living text, you know, and whether that's, you know, somebody that knows the story, or whether in some cases, you know, it's even sort of a story that takes shape after interactions throughout a lifetime. You know, so for example, you know, somebody that's 80 years old and that's lived that life, they are a living historical document. And in that sense, you know, as you said, human beings are subjective, but I think if you speak to enough people, you can paint a very informed picture of what something was, not objective, but a very informed. And I think that's the thing with knowledge, right? We know that there's no such thing as knowing everything, but, well, at least not in the physical universe. But there's this idea that to want to know is, you know, the want or the need, the thirst, the quest for knowledge, or in my case, an insatiable thirst and hunger, is actually fueled by this idea of seeing it from all those different perspectives. That in fact the subjectivity is in a way a rendering of that objective unity or essence. You know, that the pluralism or the subjectivity of life and existence and stories, for that matter, actually comes from this idea of unity, of this common humanity, of, you know, of the human condition, if you will.
I agree, and I think your point, you built nicely on my idea of human subjectivity, and to say, but still a person can have their own informed view. And to me, I think if everybody does that inner work and finds their own truth, and people are authentic, then that is how you create that unity. So it's not about being right or wrong, it's about being right with yourself.
Yes.
Right, and that's the way we forge forward. So we don't ever need to know exactly what happened in World War II or whatever, but if we can all be right with ourselves and be authentic to ourselves, and that creates that unity that you're talking about. So it's beyond, moving beyond the paradigm of right and wrong.
Indeed, yes, and you could argue a transcension of morality even. And it's very interesting because I had this conversation with somebody, and somebody said, well, you know, there's some people that transcend morality. And I said, well, you know, even if you transcend morality, there's still morality, because the way it should be, if it is the way that it should be, that doesn't mean that we then forget that this is the way. You see, so even in transcending, it's not that we're getting rid of it. We're just we're just changing how we see it. It's like the idea of being enlightened, or reaching enlightenment, or being content. It doesn't mean that necessarily the situation has changed. It means you've changed. You've changed how you see that situation.
Yes.
And I think that's profound.
I do. I agree. And it's everything we're saying is about going inside yourself, right?
Yes.
You
and
don't.
It's interesting because even the idea of inside and outside, it's kind of a physical universe construct. It's not necessarily
It's the Cartesian,
Yes,
duality.
exactly. And even Aristotle, I think, had a very an interesting observation in one of the dialogues. I think somebody said something that, what would the soul look like if it was physical? And Aristotle said something like, well, you're looking at it. And I think that's profound, because this idea of inside and outside is not, it's true on, again, it's about levels. It's true on a certain level that there's an inside and an outside. There's a difference between you and me. There's all of that. But then again, it comes to this idea of, the difference actually points towards a oneness, or not even a oneness, but it points to a common thread. Actually, I like that idea. It points to a common thread, which then it's like the idea of a garland, like people love garlands because they smell beautiful, because they're flowers, but what's holding it all together is the thread. So I think that's why in Indian and certain other, mystical or spiritual initiations, the guru or the teacher will give the disciple a thread, right? A piece of thread to say that I accept you as my disciple. And I think that's beautiful, because that's what it is. When people talk about oneness, it doesn't mean oneness. It doesn't mean a monolith. I think it's this idea that the infinity is contained within infinity, and that language sometimes renders these ideas absurd. But you know what I'm trying to say? It's not, when people say oneness, it doesn't actually mean that, it's one.
No.
It's like the idea of being all encompassing, but being all encompassing wouldn't mean that, you literally cover everything.
No. Yeah. I mean, oneness actually allows for a multiplicity of perspectives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's all contained therein.
Yeah.
It's like the idea that the Quran is contained in the dot, of the Bismillah, of the B in Bismillah, for example, right? And it's interesting because if everything is contained within that singular expression, then it gives rise to this idea that when we tell a story, all the stories are the same, but yet they're not, because you're the one telling it.
Yes. Yes. And actually, so much of how we understand life is through story.
It is.
Even, you'd be surprised, but in the business world and all kinds of interactions with people,
especially in the business world.
Yeah, it's about storytelling, right?
Yeah, like to get an investor to drop, whatever amount on your startup. Of course, it's the story you tell them. It's the relationship you have. It's everything. It's whether they trust what you're doing or not. I mean, all of that comes from the story.
Yes.
And both the story that's told and the story that's untold.
That's correct. Which goes back nicely to your idea about negative space.
So tell me about your music. Tell me what that journey has been like for you. Your journey through sound. Your journey through. Yeah, through your musical language.
It's been amazing. When I was 10 years old, I joined the Ismaili Muslim Youth Choir in Toronto, and so I was singing in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi,
You must know
Arab.
Hussein Jan Muhammad.
He's from Vancouver, so this was the Toronto choir.
Okay.
And I eventually became the conductor of that choir and
Oh wow.
composed for it and so on. And we used our kind of highlight was performing every year for the Milad an-Nabi, the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, at Roy Thompson Hall, and that was something we did year after year after year. And I really pushed the envelope to introducing kind of jazz and gospel and things that you wouldn't expect in a Maulid kind of celebration.
Absolutely.
But I pushed the envelope there. Again, talking about the common that unity, that oneness that you can find. You know, it's not that we only have to have a certain genre of music to celebrate the Prophet or to commemorate the Prophet. So that was, and then I found my way in, and I was classically trained in French horn, played that for many years. But I didn't see myself going into a classical career, so I ended up becoming a kind of pop singer. I play the keyboard and guitar as well. That's what took me to New York, and I was very much in that world. My work is very much singer-songwriter, kind of, you could say almost soul folk. But at the time in New York, everybody wanted dance, house, techno, all of that. And so they were the record companies were trying to package me in that way, and it didn't fit. And so, as I said, then I had a break and I decided to go into academia. So that's been my musical journey. It's been very exciting, very interesting. And, but as you've noted, it's an ongoing exploration. There's never an end point, you know?
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting because the idea of beginning and ending, you know, again, are very physical ideas of a beginning, of an ending, of, you know, of
the idea of time is actually
it's imaginary. Yes, it's illusory. Yes, indeed. I'm well aware of that, and that's why I actually adopted. Well, that's why I adopted the alias Infinite Possibilities. You're right. Like when I'm on stage, I'm infinite possibilities. In fact, even in life, I'm infinite possibilities. But I adopted it as a stage name, if you will. And yeah, and I think what you said about, you know, the record companies trying to package you, you'll find that when it comes to being commercial or commercialization, you know, it's not about you. It's about, you know, and in that sense, people do sell out. People do lose their authentic creative selves in order to subjugate themselves to fit some idea of what they should be in order for them to be popular or in demand or to sell, right? But I think the most interesting artists find a way to live that balance of at once being popular and critically acclaimed, or popular and without losing their own voice and their own authenticity. Of course, Bob Dylan is one of my heroes, right? So you know, and when I heard that he was nominated for the Nobel Prize, I was both overjoyed, but also, but at the same time, I also thought, well, you know, to Bob Dylan, it's not going to make any sense.
No,
right? It's not, and there's that level of absurdity, you know, and it's interesting too because the Nobel as an institution is problematic. Frankly, it's very problematic, and not just what it's based on and why it was founded, but also who they've chosen to give awards to and who they have chosen not to give awards to. That could also be, you know, fertile ground for discussion, I think, on another occasion. But frankly, when you deal with institutions, whether that's a record company, whether it's a university, whether it's a government, what you see is a series or systems of value judgments that are unfortunately not based on artistic or intellectual grounds or merits or bases, but rather on human constructions of value or a goal or a, you know, it's like what are they trying to accomplish? It's like when you see a football team and all the players are wearing jerseys and all the people that sponsor them have their logos on the t-shirt, right? So then you can see, okay, this is, you know, this is why this is the way it is. Now imagine, like on Magnus Carlsen, the chess player's jacket, there's all the names of all the people that sponsor him on his blazer. Imagine if a politician's blazer was sewn with all the logos and labels that then
There would be a blazer big enough.
Well, thank you. Yeah, exactly. Again, it's an absurd idea, but well, unless we made a giant cardboard cutout of them, and then like 4 times or 5 times life size, and then sewed a giant garment to like drape over them with all the names. Yeah. But see, this
would
is
actually be a great art installation.
Actually, you know what? You're absolutely right. That would be a great installation. That's a yeah, it's a brilliant idea actually for an installation.
It's a nice project.
Yeah. But see, again, it renders this idea of the individual versus sort of the society, and I don't say versus in that against, but I say versus in the sense of, the distinction between the person and the society, or even the distinction of the idea of the person and the idea of the society. I think that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, you obviously have a depth of philosophical understanding, and I'm sure that when you think about a story, the idea can become sometimes lost in its philosophical underpinnings. So how can a story not have a story? That's a question I'm going to ask you. How can a story not have a story? How can we tell a story, for example, that does not tell a story?
So if I teach storytelling, so the basic elements are you need a setting, you need character,
plot,
you need plot. So I think that on one level, we've talked, anything can be a text. I think anything can be a story, and we've also explored that idea.
Yes.
But I think if you did something where people were you just had one of those elements missing, you didn't have characters, for example, or you didn't have a plot. And I do sometimes say this to people who I help with their stories, that you're missing a key element that the reader would expect. Does that make it any less of a story? I guess not. You can, there are people like Franz Kafka, who played with, who like really teased their readers and played with notions of time and story plot and so on. And his amazing story called Josephine, about Josephine, this amazing singer, but it turns out she's a mouse. But he takes this absurd thing to its absurd conclusion. And some of my students are like, this is not a story. How can it be a story? She doesn't sing. And I said, you're missing the point. The fact that he got this reaction out of you means he was successful. You know what I mean? So, and actually it's very deep, because it's a story about this mouse who her artistry is so brilliant that it captivates all the mice who listen to her, even though basically what she's doing is whistling. And I say that's also a metaphor for the storyteller or the artist who can engage the audience.
Yes.
It's not about raw talent or ability, it's about ability to engage. So if you write something that I suppose that nobody picks up or nobody wants to read, or then I suppose in a sense that's not successful storytelling. Strictly speaking, I guess it's a story, but I think it's to say that in any artistry, if you're not engaging the other, it becomes onanistic,
Well said, well put.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I suppose this is an interesting segue to theater of the absurd.
Absolutely. And if you mentioned Bob Dylan, and it made me think of Joni Mitchell, and I don't know how familiar with, but she is one of my favorite songwriters in Britain. She had an interesting, started off as folk, and in the mid-70s became very pop and very successful. And then as soon as she had that, she decided to go into this jazz route, and she even went into world music with her album Don Juan's Reckless Daughter. And she lost a lot of her fan base who were like, were like, what is she doing? She could just continue making these. But that was her truth. And she went to Cuba and recorded songs, and she had African drums, and she sang in Spanish, and in a sense, people in the music business and in the popular press saw it as absurd. They thought, why are you messing with this wonderful commercial song making machine that you've become? And she said, no, this is my, and so, as she became less and less commercially successful, she also, among true scholars of songwriting, became revered, you know, like a Bob Dylan almost. Her canon of work is amazing, and her writing is poetic, and actually, so this all ties back to our conversation about music and how I shifted gears. And there was a point at which I realized that I was so enamored of Joni Mitchell and wanted to share this with people, but just being a musician myself wouldn't be the right vehicle for that. So in this novel, Tea with Miss Tanzania, there is a reference to, she has a song called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And the opening line is "Things Fall Apart," which references both the Chinua Achebe novel and the Yeats poem. And so it kind of but I realized that writing a novel was a really good way to explore this musical idea, this poetic idea that Joni Mitchell had, in a way that being a musician couldn't do. And so it got back to our conversation about finding your truth and not being afraid to cross genres or disciplinary boundaries, or even your own expectations of what it is you'll do. So in writing about Joni Mitchell, I would say that fulfilled the musician in me, even though I'm a novelist as I'm doing it.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And you know, it's interesting because people might say what she did was reckless, but actually I think it was perfectly calculated. And that the idea of giving up everything to find your truth or become your truth, I think that idea is beautiful and seldom articulated in a way that is commonly understood. But I think it's suffice it to say that even, well, of course, Prince never followed the conventional rules either, but you know, Prince used to write Joni Mitchell love letters, and you know, and they got thrown basically into the trash by the people that sorted her letters because they thought he was some lunatic because he didn't sign it Prince. But when I think about something like that and think about when I think about, you know, why are certain people revered? Why do we revere Bob Dylan as a society, or for that matter, why do people hate Bob Dylan? That's also an interesting question, because there are people that hate what he does and hate his singing and think he's not a very good singer or that he's not even a very accomplished musician. There are people that think like that.
They're missing the point.
And they're missing the point. Yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. It's like your students that said, oh, the mouse story is not a story. They're missing the point. And ironically, in missing the point, they're proving it.
Yes.
And to me, that's one of the more interesting ironies of the world, is that when people miss the point, sometimes they actually end up proving it for you. You know, they're doing the work for you.
Yes.
You know,
and Bob Dylan had even more than Joni Mitchell, a very particular political agenda. Yeah. And I think he was successful in conveying that. But I think naturally that will rub up against people in the wrong way.
Absolutely.
It disturbs the conventional discourse.
But that's what unites the most profound people, is that they're all after liberation in whatever form that it happens to be. And when I say liberation, I mean that, I mean that in every possible context.
Yes, and so if Joni or Bob, I mean, they found their liberation, and it didn't really matter what anybody thought. And hence your point about the Nobel. In some ways, it doesn't really
matter.
For Bob, it wouldn't have made sense, you know. Joni Mitchell's always miffed when people give her awards and so on. And I don't want, you know. And the other thing that's really interesting about her is she became known for her very sweet voice in the late 60s and early 70s. But as a smoker for 30 years, she completely changed the tone of her voice. She lost the higher end of that range. But her recent stuff is thick with expression. It's deep and dark and smoky, and it's It's
After smoking for
so
30 years.
expressive. I mean, it's full of pain as well. Her
Yes.
voice, it expresses so much pain, but I don't think she could have. I'm not happy that she smoked for her health, obviously, but that sound that it's produced, if you think of someone like Billie Holiday, who the experiences people have in their life, music becomes a vehicle for them
Yes.
to release that in a way that's therapeutic.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I agree. Quite. Well, it's interesting because there are people that smoke a pipe, for example, and live to be 100 or older. So, and I think it was Frank Zappa that said, cigarettes are food. I mean, I think like with anything, if you don't have to justify your life or your choices to anyone at the end of the day.
No,
you don't. And when I say that, by the way, I mean artistic and intellectual choices. I don't mean like if you killed someone, you're not accountable. In case anybody wants to render that argument in another, because people take things out of context all the time. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's very interesting that the greatest artists have had actually the greatest pain. You look at somebody like Lenny Breau, who I believe is the greatest guitarist, really, that ever graced the face of the planet. And I say that completely literally because I believe it. I mean it. Nobody could touch Lenny. Nobody. But he had a fucked up life, and he died in a horrible way. And he was addicted to drugs, to heroin, I think. But see, for me, it's
Van Gogh, for example.
Sorry.
Van Gogh, the painter.
Yes, cut off his ear. Yeah, it's interesting because that internal and outward struggle actually creates, in a sense, the most profound art. Without pain, there would be no meaning to the human condition.
Absolutely. And also those people, those artists like Van Gogh, they probably would have died much earlier if they didn't have this outlet of their art.
That's right. And of course he was making that art from an asylum.
Yes.
So it's very interesting. And this idea of health, in particular mental health, it's this idea that I believe humans are inherently dysfunctional. And indeed that's what allows us to survive. But I would say that when you're not the right kind of dysfunctional, then people will say, oh well, this is quote unquote mental illness. I'm not saying that there aren't people that are mentally ill who struggle, because that's not the point. What I'm saying though is that our idea of what health is, or what it means to be healthy, I think has been bastardized, not only by capital and commercial interests, but also by the media and by the West, unfortunately. And I'm not trying to make the West the culprit here, but I'm saying this idea of productivity, of having a career, of having a certain quality of life. I mean, these are standards. I'm not rejecting all of that. I'm the product of that. But I'm saying that if you cannot think critically about that, then you're really, really, really stuck in a paradigm that's just completely fucked up and doesn't give you the kind of room that you need in order to be a well-rounded person and a content human being.
So the world we live in has a very surprisingly narrow conception of what's an acceptable way to define your life.
Indeed.
Right. So it's basically either you can have a job, make money, and go, or perhaps be independently wealthy, or perhaps the other thing is to be completely just off the grid.
Yeah.
You don't exist basically because you don't follow these rules.
Yeah.
And so people who might naturally fall outside of that paradigm, or might be in it but question it and so on, then people like Van Gogh,
yes,
they would become ostracized because
indeed
they're so threatening to the whole thing holding together, because
yes.
the whole thing only holds together because we all comply.
That's right. It's It's our complicitness with it that allows it to perpetuate.
Yeah.
And I believe it's the same. I believe it's the same with
power.
any illusion. I
Yeah.
believe it's the same with any illusion.
Yeah. And
Go
so
on.
that's why people who question those things are ostracized, because you know, all it takes is one voice to point out the absurdity.
Indeed, it's like the emperor with no clothes.
Yeah.
But see, that's the beauty of it all, is that one person does have the power to just bring the whole thing down, to crumble it, to shatter it.
Absolutely.
And you're right, that is a threat, and it's not a threat that's taken lightly, and certainly people that do think differently, whether that's in the context of Cuba, whether that's in the context of revolutionary France, or whether that's in the context of the colonial powers that be, that were, but also that be. I mean, for example, the Queen is, in terms of land ownership, the richest person on the face of the planet.
Yes.
And to try to calculate that wealth would be beyond, it would be an exercise in absurdity.
And I'm going to bring it back to story in a way that you might not expect. So the Queen's power derives from her connection to God, because historically the monarch said it, God,
That's right.
monarch, human,
That's
or
right.
God, monarch, subject.
Indeed.
So ironically, her wealth and power attain from a story that's been told.
Yes.
And if you look, they're actually a German family, they're not even British, but that's, you know.
Yeah, an inbred mixed European family. Yes, I'm well aware.
But the story holds, and ironically, we, you know, she's the symbolic head of the Church of England, but they're not. England is not, or the UK is not. It's my home country. It's not a particularly religious society, but people still accept that authority, that wealth, based on that story that goes back centuries.
Indeed.
And that cannot possibly be true. There's no way that a monarch could be a conduit to God.
No, absolutely not. And it's the same thing even within the Ismaili paradigm and doctrine. The idea that we have to have like when people say, or they pray to the imam of the time, in their opinion, and say, you know, deliver us from this, save us from that, provide us this material wealth, spiritual prosperity, blah, blah, blah. It's stupid. It's frankly stupid, and it's absurd, because
I don't necessarily agree with that, but
I hear out my argument, because I'm gonna I'm telling a story. Hear it out. Let it play. I believe that the idea of guidance is profound, and that in fact a true guide is a conduit to the divine. However, that is not a literality. And when it is reduced to a literality, which many Ismailis do, then it becomes fucked up. Excuse me. And I think, for me, the idea of divinity is in this idea that it cannot be rendered. And that's why, you know, I don't have faith, and I don't believe in God. I believe in God. I'm stretching my hands out now. You see what I'm saying? And so when people say, okay, are you an atheist? Are you agnostic? Are you a Muslim? I think that question just demonstrates well, actually it beggars belief, because why should my spirituality have to come from somewhere? Why should my spirituality have to be justified? It needn't be. And
yes.
and I think therefore the idea of having a tariqa, or a path, is very important, and it's very beautiful, and I have no qualms with it. But like any idea, like the monarchy, it's a story that's been told, and it's a family business that is perpetuated, whether through peaceful or not so peaceful methods. And that's the thing with power. Power can never be equitable. It can be held gracefully, it can be held with dignity, it can be held accountable, but it can never be held equitably. Because in order for there to be power, that's held, and I say power obviously now in the material or human or sociological sort of context, for that power to be held or to exist, I think there has to be, it's like a scale, it's like a karmic scale, you know, it's like if something goes, it's like the idea that when you go so deep, then there's also that it's the idea of balance. There's an equilibrium that has to be maintained. So, you know, if you're going to dive to the depths of the ocean, to the depths of the Mariana Trench, and you're dealing with the intense pressure of a situation like that, and I say pressure literally, because, you know, as you go deeper and deeper, there's more pressure. When you go higher and higher, for example, and the oxygen becomes less, you know, for example, like if you go in a hot air balloon and you went too high, right? Again, pressure, the shift. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in nature, however the nature is, the idea of a hospitable environment, the only reason that an environment is hospitable, and now I'm using a biodiverse or ecological metaphor or reference to this idea of power. Yes, a relationship can be symbiotic, for example, you know, like the fungus that lives on the tree may provide the tree with certain nutrients, for example. I'm just creating a random example. And the relationship is the relationship. But who is in power there, the tree or the fungus? Now, let's bring that back to the human context of, for example, the monarchy, or in the Ismaili case, the imamate, or the institution of the imamate, the office of the imamate. For it to get its power, for it to hold its power, and for it to perpetuate itself, that's the working of a story right there. Mm-hmm. And when you examine it, it's the story we tell ourselves. It's the stories we're told, and in the case of the monarchy or the imam or any government, even the idea of a president, we tell ourselves that these institutions represent us, or the best of us, right? And that's the reason they continue to be in power, and that's the reason they perpetuate. Plain and simple. Whether that's true or not is an entirely different question.
Yeah, and I think it's worth thinking about in the political context. Is there anywhere, I can't think of anywhere in the world, there's a politician who hasn't somehow taken advantage of that power and tipped the scale? You know, because no politician will say, well, I'll just give everything back, or you know, you get politicians who sometimes forego their salary. The mayor of New York did that. The last president of the US did that. But in some ways, it's not
about that. It's kind of like saying that I'm a Sufi because I wear a wool robe.
Right. So I think our world needs to find, and this is a serious, I've probably thought about this my entire life, new ways of existing and administering the world. I don't want to use the word ruling or governing or anything like that.
Administering is correct, yes. Or stewarding,
that are not inherently inegalitarian.
Indeed.
Because the minute you elevate someone and say, well, this person has the power to make laws that can affect your life, and well, you can write them an email. You know,
yes.
It's that with that story, that maintains that power differential.
Yes, that's right, and that's why I don't believe, for example, in the idea of talent, because you see, everybody has talent, everybody has the spark. The difference is, some people extinguish it, some people feed it. So you know, just because a fire is burning, you know, just because the sun is burning at a certain temperature, you know, doesn't mean that that's actually hot. How's that for an interesting thought experiment?
That really is, and it takes you to the very well-known idea of people walking on hot coals and not feeling any pain. And So the power of the mind
over matter. Yes, because again, matter is a construct of the mind. Of that.
Actually, this Afraz, pain is a construct.
Indeed. It is. And yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting. Yes, pain is a construct, but trauma isn't. How's that? That's fascinating, because the feeling of that pain is real, but the pain itself isn't. How's that? That is fascinating. That is very fascinating.
It is. And in fact, it's the verbalization, the vocalization, the expression of ouch, I feel this thing. It's the making it into a text or making it into a story that renders it relatable for other people.
Yes. You know, I see this podcast or in fact, my whole series, the whole podcast is a text or a series of texts. And I sort of think of it as a library or an archive, you know. And I believe that my whole body of work, my oeuvre, is in a sense a collection. So I think of myself as sort of a collector come explorer, and that's what my professorship is. You know, is sort of, you know, the exploration of every facet of you know, like when people say, oh, well, what are you interested in? I'll say everything and nothing. Or I'll say, you know, I want to know everything about everything, you know, and people will say, well, that's not really possible. You know, how can you do that? You need a focus. But I think, again, it comes to this idea of text. I mean, I think the subtext is the text in a way, right? This idea of wanting to know is in a way almost more interesting than knowing itself, because how can one want to know if there is nothing to know?
I agree.
And that's what allows for there to be a game.
I agree. And you can, I mean, a very nice example of that is the love story, right? The romance.
Yes.
Where the chase, you know, once you've conquered that, then it's you kind of, you know, everything. But before you know, there's mystery, right? Yes. There's the unknown, and that's also translates to Sufism and Rumi and Shams and whoever.
But the beautiful thing is, even when you do transcend, somebody like Mansur al-Halaj, who said Ana al-Haq, or I am the truth, or I am God. I think in a way, actually, he didn't solve the mystery. He just deepened it. Yeah. For himself.
And again, he was a real threat to the authorities, right? Because if everybody starts realizing they are the truth, that's going to shake up power structures, right? So they had to kill him.
That's right. That he was killed. That's right. He was executed.
And the myth goes, you know, that after they chopped off his head kept saying Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq, you know. Which I think is actually a really lovely story. I mean, for quite a gruesome act.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, pain can be a therapy. It can be therapeutic.
Yes.
And some people actively seek it.
Yeah, and so this is reminding me of a particular passage in my novel, where the basic story of the novel is a mother reaching out to her estranged son to try and make things right with him, and she's sharing all these kind of fascinating events that happened to her back in Tanzania. But at some point she kind of tries to break through her son's grief and say, look, you know, I know grief is almost addictive. It's you can lose yourself and you can drown yourself in your sorrows. It's kind of, I mean, I use this metaphor of, it's like being in the rain. At some point you let yourself be soaked, and it's cleansing. You know, it's like walking through fire. It's beautiful, it's painful, but you immerse yourself fully and it becomes but it can become all encompassing. It can consume you.
Well, isn't that wasn't it Rumi who said, burn me up? Yeah, no, he Rumi said that, burn me up into a crisp, you know, just you know, and then the idea was that then it was talking about the ego, obviously, metaphysically. I want no sense of self. And Shams showed him that. The story goes that one of the stories goes that Shams walked past Rumi, who was reading these books. Shams asked him, well, "What's in those books?" Rumi says, "No, you wouldn't understand." So then Shams throws the books into a fountain, right? And then Rumi picks them up, and they're completely dry. And then Rumi asks him, How did you do that?" So Shams says, "Well, you wouldn't understand."
Yeah,
And
beautiful.
and I think it's fascinating because it looks at this idea of what does it mean to understand. For me to say, well, I understand. And yeah, I think true understanding is actually not understanding, in a way.
I agree. It's like the more you know, the more you realize how little you know, and that you can never.
Indeed, and it's that absurdity. It's like the idea that if somebody says no to you, that can be far more sexually interesting than them saying yes.
Yeah. So it's the idea that if you know that you cannot know everything, then actually you know everything, because that's the secret, right? So it's kind of like the Rumi poem.
Yeah, that is the secret. Now all the Sufi sheikhs we're gonna have fatwas on our head for unveiling the secret.
No. I mean, Sufi sheikhs are very. They don't. Their fatwa.
That was a joke. That was a joke. That was a bad joke. But
the seeker comes and knocks on the door, and the respondent says, "Who is it? It is I. Go away."
Yeah.
Knocks on the door next week. "Who is it? It is I. Go away." Third week, knock knock. "Who is it? It is you. Come in." Right? So actually, would you agree that the annihilation of self or ego is a necessary step on the path to enlightenment?
Well, arrogance and humility are the same, so yes.
And when you don't have that construct of the self informing your worldview, you can see much more, right?
No, when the construct of the self does not exist, then you have transcended understanding. It's not about that anymore. It's not about you. That's the point. It's not about you. It's not about whether you understand or don't understand. That's what fanafila is.
Yes. Yes, it's not about whether you understand. That's the essence of it right there. Oh, we've landed on a very profound point.
Yeah. Indeed. Senseless sensibility.
Yes. So it's the ego always thinks everything is knowable.
Or that it has to know. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But when you accept that it cannot know, it does transcend.
Right. And it's interesting because actually it's not that it cannot know. It's even deeper. I would say it's this idea that the idea of knowledge is a construct. The idea of wisdom is a construct, and it's necessitated by life, because the purpose of life is knowledge, right? When you look at things from an evolutionary point of view, whatever was learned was passed down. The reason a cactus can survive in the desert is because of its history, because of its evolution, because it learned, because the whole point of its existence was to learn. But when one has achieved fila, then or moksha, the Hindus call it moksha. When one has achieved liberation, then in the truest sense, both physically and spiritually, then life is rendered absurd. It's a play. It's a chessboard.
Yes.
It's not about the pieces anymore. It's not even about the board.
No.
Because I can play chess with a pigeon The pigeon can shit on the board and think it's won, and I can be very upset. But who actually won that game? And yeah, and you'll never know, and that's kind of the funny thing. That's one of the funny things about that story. But that's the point. Why do we bother playing? Right? There's something in the play that appeals us, that draws us.
Yeah.
You know, there's something in not knowing. There's something in the piece of wood. You imbue it with a character, with a life, with this, you know. So I think transcension or fanafila, or however you want to think about it, spirituality is actually a very practical thing, right? Because the idea of knowledge is only necessitated by not knowing, right? So if I was truly wise, then it wouldn't matter whether I knew what you were talking about or I didn't. I would understand anyway.
That's correct. So getting back to your analogy of the cactus, humans are in a strange position because we have the potential to know so much more than just what we need to do to survive in the desert. You know, but actually that ability can also be, it's a gift for those who seek, you know, knowledge beyond just what, okay, to survive I need this. But it can also be a burden because you think that it matters what you know, and you know, when it actually doesn't, right?
Yes, ironically. Yes, indeed. And it's interesting too, because we make value judgments about things all the time. For example, the idea that, you know, oh, China is, you know, or Russia, for example, are politically sort of non-solvent in the same way as it's like the idea of, you know, the hand is either in a velvet glove or bare knuckle. You know, I think power and control exist in both political situations. It's just in the West, we think we're free and that we have the freedom. We don't. And I mean that both literally and non-literally. I mean, for example, I can, in Toronto, in the Pride Parade, for example, I could wear a dress and a wig and makeup and flaunt my pride openly and publicly. But let's remove the context of the Pride Parade, and let's say I'm coming home alone from a bar at 2 a.m. and that's what I'm wearing. Would I be safe on the streets of Toronto? So I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, in China, for example, you can, you know, the control is very literal, and they've even built a system of social credit, where if you do things the right way, you get access to things and all that. But we have the same thing in the West. It's just not as documented.
It's more subtle.
It's more subtle. It's more subtle. That's right. So I think what you're saying about knowledge, or even to know or not to know, I think the subjugation can only occur in the context of being the subject to the object. Once you've transcended the subject-object division, or the subject-object state or illusion, for example, in quantum physics, then in a both a practical and spiritual sense, the things that used to matter, the things that were what you lived for, no longer are. You know, so in that sense, the way one would live, the way one would carry themselves would be very different. For a truly content person to be in a space, you can feel the contentment. It's you couldn't, not everybody could articulate it, but you could feel, okay, this person is content. They don't want anything from me. They don't need anything from me. They're not asking me. They're not even asking themselves. They just are.
Yes.
And after all, isn't that what true spirituality is about? It's about contentment.
Yes, and such people are very rare to encounter.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Extremely, extremely rare. one hopes though that one meets oneself in such a way, and I say oneself, of course, now in the non-literal sense, because that is the natural state, I think, is that sense of contentment. It's the
Yeah, I mean, in the Buddhist idea, it's that all pain comes from attachment and desire.
exactly, and that samsara only, no, absolutely, and so that's why I believe that, for example, to say, oh, I'm a Buddhist, or oh, I'm a Sufi, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because I'm both and neither.
Yeah, and wanting contentment is actually, it's the wrong way to go about it, because if you're
Yes.
seeking contentment, then
Because you want it. The self is there. You want. No. Yeah. No, you're right. That is the wrong way to go about it, because contentment is the relinquishment of that control.
I think a better way to think about it is be content.
Yeah, to be content. Yes. Treat it as a doing. Yes. Treat it as an adjective. Treat it as an action word. Yes. Be content. Yes. Very good. Yes, exactly. I agree. I concur. I think that's exactly that's a very wise way of putting it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Be content. Yeah.
Well, we've hit on some
very interesting points, and I think this has been a very fruitful, for me anyway, and I hope for you, a very fruitful encounter.
It has, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny to have such conversations with someone you've never met in person before. You know, and ironically, the people in your life you don't, on a daily basis, you don't necessarily have these kinds of conversations with, but I do think it's the vehicle of art and artistry that enables us to step outside of, you know, usual paradigms and examine these big questions.
Yes, indeed, and I think the true legacy of any culture and the true wealth of any culture is in its artistic and intellectual achievements, and in the process that it took to get to them.
Yes, which goes back to our beginning about, do I enjoy the process of writing?
Yes. It's fascinating how self-referential this. It's almost like the Quran. Every you know, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim just gets said over and over and over. It's like, well, I guess that's an important phrase, isn't it?
And it also links to contentment, because when I'm writing, I'm very content. So it's not knowing people will read it or the product, and it's just the actual act of doing that itself is a very fulfilling one.
You're in love with the act, and you're in love with the process of actually putting pen to paper, and that's beautiful. Yeah. And it's the same for me as a musician. I'm in love with that, and I'm in love with that process, and I think.
And I can see that when I see you on stage, and I see, I mean, you are actually transcending a certain realm of possibility, which is why it makes sense you call yourself Infinite Possibilities. As one artist,
I hope I live up to that.
Yeah, I recognize that that journey. It's a journey. We've never have reached it fully. There's no destination. It's a journey. But I recognize that you are very much on that journey, and it's a journey that I identify with. You know.
Thank you, and well, yeah, I think you're a kindred spirit. Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and here's to this being the first chapter of our story.
Absolutely, it was an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me on.
Okay.